Here is the full expanded Part 1 in plain text. The royal hatchling wouldn't stop crying. Then a human served Earth food that made her laugh. Part 1 The Inconsolable Princess. The imperial creche of the Vorkith Empire was, by any measurable standard, the most sophisticated childcare facility in 4-star systems. Its walls were composed of adaptive bioceramic panels that shifted temperature, texture, and luminosity in response to a hatchling's physiological cues. Its floors were layered with 3 inches of pressure-sensitive polymer gel that could detect the weight distribution of a creature as small as a newly hatched Vorkith, approximately the mass of a large Earth housecat, though with considerably more limbs and a great deal more opinion. The air recyclers ran on a dual-loop system that maintained optimal atmospheric composition for juvenile Vorkith respiration while also being carefully filtered against 47 known allergens. The ambient sound architecture was tuned to frequencies that the Empire's foremost xenopediatric researchers had spent 11 years identifying as conducive to hatchling calm. None of it was working. The sound filling the creche was not calm. It was not even close to calm. It was a sustained crystalline shriek that had been going on. Marcus Webb checked his wrist comm for the 4th time in 10 minutes, for just over 6 hours, and which had already driven 2 maintenance workers, 1 junior diplomat from the Terran embassy, and a visiting dignitary from the Sketh Collective to quietly excuse themselves from the East Wing entirely. The sound had a particular quality to it, a kind of resonant, piercing clarity that seemed engineered by nature to bypass every rational filter in the adult brain and lodge directly in the part responsible for existential dread. Marcus had once stood 30 meters from a launch pad during an unscheduled engine test. This was worse. He stood in the doorway of the creche and did what any reasonable man in his position would do. He reconsidered every decision he had ever made. Marcus Elliott Webb was 41 years old, a senior trade liaison for the Terran Diplomatic Corps, and had spent the better part of a decade negotiating complex resource-sharing agreements between humanity and its increasingly numerous galactic neighbors. He was good at his job. He was patient, methodical, culturally fluent in 4 alien languages and functionally conversational in 2 more, and had a reputation in the Corps for keeping his composure in situations that caused less experienced diplomats to develop stress-related medical conditions. He had once sat across a table from a Veldhari war chieftain for 9 hours without breaking eye contact, a feat that had later been described in the official debrief as inadvisable but ultimately effective. He had not, in the course of any of this, ever been placed in charge of a screaming infant. The chain of events that had led to this moment was, in retrospect, almost impressively absurd. 3 days ago, Marcus had arrived at the Vorkith Imperial Palace complex on Velsoth Prime to finalize negotiations on a trade agreement that had been 18 months in the making, a deal involving Earth's proprietary atmospheric processing technology and the Vorkith's vast reserves of deep-core mineral compounds, worth approximately 3 billion credits annually and carrying implications for 40 years of interstellar economic relations. It was, by any reasonable metric, the most important assignment of his career. Then the Vorkith Bureaucratic Council had experienced what his cultural attaché delicately described as a procedural recalibration, which meant, in plain language, that 3 of the 9 required signatory ministers were simultaneously unavailable due to a dispute over ceremonial precedence that had apparently been simmering since the reign of the previous empress's grandmother. The delay was expected to last 4 to 7 days. Marcus had been politely installed in the east wing of the palace as an honored guest, given access to the palace's considerable amenities, and left largely to his own devices. The trouble had started on day 2, when he had taken what he thought was a shortcut through the residential corridor on his way back from the palace's communications suite. He had dropped his datapad. He had bent to retrieve it. He had in doing so been in close physical proximity to the door of the Imperial creche at the precise moment that one of the hatchling attendants had stepped out to deal with what she later described as a minor nutritional emergency. The Vorkith concept of proximity equals responsibility was not a metaphor. It was encoded in their legal and social architecture at a level so fundamental that most Vorkith did not consciously think about it any more than humans thought about breathing. An adult in physical proximity to an unattended juvenile was, in Vorkith law and custom, temporarily responsible for that juvenile's welfare until a designated caregiver returned. The fact that Marcus was a human, a foreign national, a diplomat, and entirely unqualified was noted in subsequent discussions. But the law, as the palace chamberlain gently explained, did not contain a carve-out for interstellar visitors. He had been in the doorway for 12 seconds before anyone explained this to him. That had been 6 hours ago. She refuses all standard comfort protocols, Hatchling Counselor Vrethna reported, approaching Marcus with the bearing of someone delivering a military situation briefing and the expression of someone who had not slept in a very long time. Vrethna was a Vorkith elder of considerable distinction. Her credentials in juvenile developmental care spanned 3 decades, 2 imperial appointments, and a monograph on hatchling neurological patterning that was, Marcus had been told, considered definitive in the field. She was also, at this particular moment, visibly holding herself together through what appeared to be sheer professional pride. 4 of her 6 hands were pressed flat against the cranial frills that ran along either side of her elongated head. A gesture Marcus had learned was the Vorkith equivalent of rubbing one's temples. The frequency analysis suggests existential dissatisfaction, Vrethna continued. Marcus looked at her, then he looked at the source of the sound. Princess Siveth III, royal hatchling, first clutch of her imperial radiance, the Empress Velsova IV, was sitting in the center of the creche floor on what appeared to be a cushion made of woven starlight, or at least something that behaved very much like it, softly luminescent and shifting, and she was screaming. She was 14 months old by Vorkith reckoning, which placed her somewhere in the developmental neighborhood of a human toddler, and she had the physical characteristics of someone who was going to be very impressive indeed in about 15 years and was absolutely furious about the weight. Her scales were iridescent silver, catching the creche's carefully tuned light and throwing it back in fractured liquid patterns. Her 4 eyes, arranged in a slight arc across her face, larger and more luminous than an adult Vorkith's, were streaming with something that functioned as tears, though the drops were faintly bioluminescent and left brief trails of pale light on her cheeks before evaporating. Her 2 small vestigial wings, remnants of an evolutionary history that xenobiologists found fascinating, fanned open and shut in rapid, agitated pulses. In one of her 4 tiny hands, she was clutching what Marcus recognized as a rattle made of actual platinum, the surface etched with intricate dynastic symbols. As Marcus watched, she hurled it at the far wall with startling force. It left a dent. She's 14 months old, Marcus said, returning his attention to Vrethna with some effort. She's not having an existential crisis. She's probably just… He stopped, reorganized his thoughts, tried to locate something useful in his memory. He was not a parent. He had not spent meaningful time around infants of any species. What he knew about childcare was largely theoretical and mostly derived from a single 3-day cultural immersion briefing he had received before an earlier assignment to the Keth border stations, which had touched on Vorkith hatchling development primarily in the context of understanding why certain negotiation sessions were occasionally interrupted. Bored, he said, or hungry, or uncomfortable, something concrete. She has been offered 47 approved nutrient formulations, Vrethna said. The way she said 47 conveyed with quiet precision the enormity of what had been attempted and the full scale of its failure. Did she eat any of them? The silence that followed was long and dignified and deeply expressive. No, Vrethna said. Behind her, arranged in a loose, defeated semicircle, stood the 17 specialists. They were a mixed assembly of Vorkith developmental experts, neurological consultants, and 3 off-world pediatric advisors retained by the palace on permanent retainer for exactly this kind of emergency. They looked collectively like people who had done everything correctly and could not account for what was happening. 2 of them were quietly consulting each other behind a tablet. One was staring at the ceiling in a way that suggested silent philosophical revision. A 4th had the look of a person mentally composing their letter of resignation. The 2 neural pattern soothing units, elegant pieces of technology, smooth-surfaced and non-threatening, designed to emit resonance frequencies calibrated to juvenile Vorkith neurology, stood powered down against the near wall. Siveth had bitten them both within the first hour. The evidence was still visible on the nearer unit's casing in the form of small, determined, and surprisingly deep bite marks. Siveth screamed again. The sound went through Marcus like a tuning fork strike to the base of the skull. He had in the past 6 hours moved through several distinct psychological phases in response to it. Initial alarm, then determined calm, then a kind of numbed professional endurance, and now something that sat in the territory between resigned acceptance and the very early warning signs of genuine desperation. His back teeth ached in a specific, targeted way that he did not think teeth were supposed to ache. He was fairly sure he had developed a tension headache that was going to require serious pharmacological attention once this was over. He was also, underneath all of that, trying very hard to think clearly, because something about the situation, something about the way Siveth had looked at him briefly between one scream and the building of the next, with those 4 luminous and furious and exhausted eyes, was nagging at a part of his brain that had nothing to do with diplomatic protocol. He crossed the room, not toward the specialists or the soothing units or Vrethna with her briefings and her frequency analyzes. He crossed toward Siveth herself, moving slowly and without the kind of brisk purposefulness that small distressed creatures of any species tended to find alarming. He crouched down all the way down onto the balls of his feet, close enough to the polymer gel floor that he could feel the faint give of it under his weight, until he was approximately at her eye level. And he looked at her. She looked back. She did not for a moment scream, not because she was calming down or because his presence was soothing or because anything had been fixed. She stopped because something new had appeared in her immediate environment, and new things in the eternal and universal calculus of small unhappy creatures everywhere, briefly and automatically outranked ongoing misery. Her 4 eyes fixed on his face with an intensity that was slightly unnerving at close range. Her nostrils, small and neat and currently flared with effort, worked in short, investigative bursts. Her wings slowed their frantic fanning to something more considered. She was, Marcus realized, looking at him the way you looked at something that might conceivably be interesting, if it turned out to be the right kind of interesting. But she was reserving full judgment pending further data. And in that pause in the brief quiet between her last scream and whatever came next, Marcus looked back at her, and all the alien architecture of her face, the bioluminescent tear tracks, the iridescent scales, the 4 eyes in their unfamiliar arc, the vestigial wings, all of it seemed for just a moment to fall away. Or not fall away exactly. More like become transparent. Still there, fully present, entirely itself, but no longer obscuring the thing underneath it. He had seen that expression before, not on a Vorkith, not on anything with scales or 4 eyes or wings. He had seen it in airports, in the backs of cars on long journeys, in waiting rooms and crowded corridors, and any place where a small creature had been required to endure more than small creatures were designed to endure. He had seen it on the faces of human children at the end of long days, and in pictures of animal young in distress, and somewhere in the back of his memory, he thought he had probably worn it himself, in some early and pre-verbal part of his life that he could no longer consciously access, but that his body apparently still remembered. It was the expression of a small creature who was absolutely, comprehensively, and non-negotiably done. Done with the 47 nutrient formulations. Done with the frequency analyses and the resonance calibrations and the neurological consultants. Done with the 17 specialists and their tablets and their quiet, worried huddles. Done with the soothing units, which she had addressed in the only language available to her at the time. Done with the luminescent cushion and the adaptive walls and the carefully maintained atmospheric composition, and all the sophisticated, optimized, extensively researched infrastructure of the most advanced childcare facility in 4-star systems. Done most fundamentally with being handled, with being assessed, with being offered solutions to a problem that no one had actually bothered to ask her about. Marcus understood this feeling. He had felt a version of it himself in the 3rd hour of certain negotiations, when every party at the table was working very hard and in complete good faith, and yet nothing was moving, because everyone was solving the wrong problem in increasingly elaborate ways. The feeling when everything on offer is correct in every measurable sense, and yet none of it is what you actually need, and you cannot articulate what you actually need. And the gap between those two things has become the entire world, and the only response left is a scream, which at least has the virtue of being honest. She was, he thought, not broken. She was not malfunctioning. She was not experiencing existential dissatisfaction in any clinical sense. She was a small person in a large and complicated place, surrounded by adults who were trying extremely hard to help her in all the ways they knew how, and none of those ways were the right way, and she had been communicating this clearly for 6 hours and no one had understood. Marcus stood up. He was quiet for a moment, not thinking exactly, more like letting something settle into place. Right, he said. The word was quiet and even and carried in it a particular quality of decision. Not the decision of certainty, because he was not certain, but the decision of a man who has recognized that uncertainty is no longer a useful state to remain in and that the only available direction is forward. He turned toward the corridor that led to the east wing, and the modest kitchen that had been assigned to his personal use, and the travel bag sitting on the counter beside the cooling unit, still mostly packed from the transit shuttle because he had not, in 3 days of bureaucratic limbo and 1 very long afternoon of infant crisis management, found the time or inclination to properly unpack. Ambassador Webb, Vrethna said from behind him. Her tone was measured, but it contained a very precisely calibrated quantity of alarm, the alarm of someone who has been managing a difficult situation for 6 hours and is watching the most recent variable walk away down a corridor without explanation. The established protocols require. I'll be 5 minutes, Marcus said without stopping. He did not look back. There was nothing useful to be communicated by looking back. Behind him, Scythe drew breath and the brief interesting pause ended, and the screaming resumed, and the sound followed him down the corridor and around the corner like a small and furious comet, and Marcus Webb walked toward the kitchen with the quiet, focused, unhurried stride of a man who had finally stopped trying to solve the problem correctly and had decided to try the other way instead. He had no idea if it would work. He was going to try it anyway. The contraband. The kitchen assigned to Marcus's personal use was small, functional, and aggressively neutral in the way that palace guest quarters tended to be, designed to be inoffensive to any of a dozen possible species, and therefore genuinely comfortable to none of them. The counter surfaces were a pale, seamless material that was either stone or a very convincing imitation of it. The cooling unit hummed at a frequency slightly too low to be consciously noticed and slightly too present to be fully ignored. The lighting was calibrated to a spectrum that was technically adequate for human vision while also being technically adequate for 4 other visual systems, which meant it was perfect for no one and had the quality of a waiting room that had given up trying. Marcus did not notice any of this. He was already moving toward the counter before the door had fully closed behind him, already scanning the room with the specific, efficient gaze of a man who has a task and a time limit and no patience for anything that is not directly relevant to both. His travel bag was where he had left it, sitting beside the cooling unit with the particular patient solidity of luggage that had been carried across 4 star systems and had developed, through sheer accumulated mileage, a kind of stoic character. It was a standard-issue diplomatic core field bag, durable and plain, with reinforced corners and a locking mechanism that had survived 3 separate customs inspections, 1 unscheduled search by a suspicious border authority on the Keth outer stations, and a luggage handler on Proxima Transit who had apparently believed that fragile labels were suggestions rather than instructions. Marcus unzipped it and began moving through the contents with methodical speed. Every diplomat carried food from home. This was not an official policy of the Terran Diplomatic Corps. The official policy was that personnel should make reasonable efforts to adapt to local nutritional options as a demonstration of cultural respect. But it was an unofficial and near-universal practice, the kind of thing that was never discussed in briefings and never mentioned in reports, and was, nonetheless, understood by everyone who had ever spent more than 2 weeks on an alien posting to be as essential to psychological survival as adequate sleep and reliable communication with home. You could adapt to a great many things. You could learn to read 6 kinds of alien body language and navigate 17 distinct cultural protocols around physical proximity, and manage the specific exhaustion of performing competence in a language that was not your own for 14 hours at a stretch. What you could not do, or at least what Marcus had found he could not do, was eat nutrient paste for 14 consecutive days without something in him quietly and persistently folding. He had packed as he always did, pragmatically and without sentiment, 2 packets of instant noodles because they were compact and calorie-dense and required nothing more sophisticated than hot water, which was available in most structures in the known galaxy. A sleeve of plain crackers, the kind that tasted of very little but had a satisfying solidity to them, the edible equivalent of a firm handshake. A sealed tin of fruit cocktail, which he had packed primarily because the tin was small and the caloric density was reasonable, and partly, if he was honest, because the sweetness of it was something that his body apparently still associated with particular childhood memories of being unwell and cared for, which was not something he had ever said aloud to anyone and did not intend to. Some dried mango, bought at a transit hub on the way out, because the vendor had been enthusiastic about it and Marcus had been tired and had not sufficiently defended himself against enthusiasm. And at the very bottom of the bag, tucked beside a spare power cell and a small first aid kit, and the folded emergency thermal blanket that the Corps required all field personnel to carry regardless of destination, a small sealed container of peanut butter. The peanut butter was not pragmatic. The peanut butter was the one item in the bag that Marcus would have had difficulty defending to an auditor. It was heavy relative to its caloric contribution. It could not be eaten directly without the crackers, and so was functionally dependent on another item in the bag. And it served no nutritional purpose that could not have been served by something smaller and more sensible. What it served was a different kind of purpose entirely, the purpose of a thing that is entirely, unambiguously, specifically itself, that tastes precisely like what it tastes like and nothing else, that connects you to a very particular set of memories and associations, and therefore, in some way that is difficult to quantify but absolutely real, connects you to yourself. Marcus had eaten peanut butter from a jar with a spoon while reading dispatches at 2 in the morning in more alien time zones than he could easily count, and it had, on each of those occasions, performed its function perfectly. He set it on the counter, he looked at it, he looked at the crackers. He had absolutely no idea what a Vorkath hatchling could safely eat. This was not a small gap in his knowledge. This was a significant and potentially serious gap in his knowledge, the kind of gap that had in other contexts involving other species and other substances. resulted in diplomatic incidents, medical emergencies, and in one notorious case in the early years of Earth's galactic engagement, an interspecies incident report that was still cited in core training as an example of what happened when well-intentioned personnel took action without adequate biological information. Marcus was aware of this history. He was aware in the abstract that alien metabolisms were varied and unpredictable, and that something perfectly benign to a human could, depending on the species in question, be anywhere on a spectrum from mildly inadvisable to genuinely catastrophic. He was also aware that S-Siveth had been screaming for 6 hours and had bitten 2 neural pattern soothing units, and that 17 specialists and 1 hatchling counselor with 3 decades of credentials had not been able to make it stop, and that the gap between "I don't know if this is safe" and "I know for certain that the current situation is sustainable" was, at this particular moment, not actually as wide as it might otherwise have seemed. He pulled out his wrist comm. The shipnet connection was slower than he would have liked. Palace communications infrastructure was optimized for Vorkith data protocols and treated human comm systems with the polite but minimal effort of a translator who found the source language somewhat beneath their abilities. But it connected, and Marcus began searching with the focused efficiency of a man who has a specific question and a finite amount of time to answer it. Vorkith hatchling metabolism, Vorkith digestive biochemistry, Vorkith xenonutrition cross-species. He moved through the queries quickly, discarding anything that was too technical to parse in under 30 seconds, prioritizing anything that contained the words baseline compatibility or cross-species trial or, ideally, human food. He was looking for either a hard no or a reasonable yes, and he needed to find it in the next few minutes before Vrethna came looking for him or S-Siveth's screaming reached a frequency that caused structural damage to something irreplaceable. He found it in 11 minutes and 40 seconds, in a paper published by the Xenobiology Institute of New Geneva, buried in the supplementary data of a comparative metabolic study that had been, based on its citation count, read by approximately 40 people in the entire galaxy. The relevant finding was in a footnote, the kind of footnote that researchers include because the data is real and should be recorded and they are not quite sure what to do with it, which stated, in the measured and slightly bemused language of scientists who have encountered a result they had not expected, that Vorkith digestive biochemistry shared a 73% functional overlap with baseline mammalian metabolic processes. A convergent evolutionary development that the authors described as remarkable and of potential practical significance, and which Marcus, reading it on a small screen in a palace kitchen while a royal infant screamed 2 corridors away, found to be the most practically significant piece of scientific information he had encountered in recent memory. 73% was not 100%, he was aware of this. There was still a 27% that was unaccounted for, and he had no way of knowing in the next 60 seconds what was in that 27% or whether any of what he was about to do was sitting inside it. But 73% was also not zero. 73% was, in the risk calculus of a man who had spent a decade making decisions in conditions of incomplete information, a number that could be worked with. A number that suggested, without guaranteeing, that the worst was unlikely. He put down the comm. He looked at the crackers. He looked at the peanut butter. He looked at the dried mango, which he picked up and turned over in his hands for a moment, thinking about fruit sugars and palatability and the universal tendency of small creatures toward sweetness, which was, as far as he knew, one of the few things that evolution had arrived at independently and consistently across more species than almost any other preference. He got a small bowl from the cabinet above the counter. It was a Vorkith bowl, slightly wider and shallower than the equivalent human vessel, but it would serve. He placed 1 cracker in it. He opened the peanut butter, and with the spreading implement he found in the utensil drawer, applied a modest amount to the cracker's surface. Not extravagant, not a trial of the thing. Just enough to be present, enough to smell, enough to be tasted if a small clawed hand happened to bring it to a small curious mouth. He took 3 pieces of dried mango and placed them beside the cracker. He looked at the arrangement for a moment. Then, with no clear reason he could have articulated and no expectation that it would matter, he repositioned the mango pieces into a rough triangle around the cracker. It was, objectively, a meaningless gesture. The mango did not know it was in a triangle. The cracker did not benefit from the arrangement. Whatever calculation S-Siveth's 14-month-old nervous system would perform upon encountering the bowl would almost certainly not include aesthetic assessment of the food arrangement. And yet, it seemed somehow friendlier. Less like a test and more like an offering. Less like the 47th in a series of approved nutrient formulations being presented by a specialist following a protocol, and more like something that a person had put together and brought across a corridor because they thought it might be nice. Marcus picked up the bowl and walked back. The sound reached him before he turned the last corner. It had not diminished in the approximately 12 minutes he had been gone, and if anything had acquired a second wind, a fresh intensity that suggested Scythe had briefly paused for respiratory maintenance and had returned to the task with renewed commitment. He pushed open the creche door and walked in, and 17 sets of eyes turned toward him, and Vrethna turned toward him, and the bowl in his hands was apparently visible enough and unexpected enough that for a moment, a brief and curious moment, even the ambient tension in the room shifted slightly. Then Vrethna's gaze landed on the bowl's contents, and her cranial frills spread to their maximum extent, and her expression became the expression of a person watching something they cannot stop and are not certain they are going to be able to explain to their superiors. That, she said, in the measured tone of someone choosing words very carefully while experiencing feelings that were anything but measured, is not an approved nutritional offering. I know, Marcus said. He did not stop walking. The palace kitchen maintains a comprehensive list of hatchling-safe consumables, cross-referenced against current developmental stage, physiological indicators, and the shipnet says the metabolic chemistry is compatible, Marcus said, 73% overlap with mammalian digestion. New Geneva Xenobiology Institute supplementary data, footnote 11. He glanced at her briefly. She's been crying for 6 hours. Your alternative is what exactly? The silence that followed was slightly different from the earlier silences. The earlier silences had been the silences of people who had run out of answers. This one had a slightly more complex texture, still containing the absence of answers, but also containing the particular quality of a room full of experts calculating whether they would rather take responsibility for the current situation or responsibility for whatever came next, and finding the math unexpectedly difficult. No one said anything. Marcus crossed the room. He did not approach Scythe with the brisk, purposeful efficiency he might have applied to other problems. He moved the way he had learned, over years of working with species whose threat response systems were calibrated differently from his own, to move when approach mattered. Without hurry, without drama, telegraphing each step as clearly as a body could telegraph anything. His own nervous system was suggesting, with some insistence, that he was holding a bowl of contraband food and about to offer it to the first clutch of the Empress of the Vorkith Dominion without medical authorization, and that this was perhaps a situation that warranted more careful consideration than he had given it. He told his nervous system that they were past that point, and it needed to settle down. He sat on the floor. He did not sit in a chair and lean forward. He did not crouch beside the bowl and then stand up again. He sat fully on the floor, cross-legged, the way he would have sat as a child, the way he had not sat in any professional context in his adult life, and he placed the bowl on the polymer gel surface between himself and Scythe, and he settled his hands in his lap and he waited. Behind him, the sound of 17 specialists processing what they had just witnessed. A senior trade liaison of the Terran Diplomatic Corps sitting on the floor of the Imperial Creche moved through the room in a wave of very quiet, very restrained, very professional astonishment. Vrethna made a sound that was not quite a word. Someone near the back of the semicircle made a different sound that was not quite a word either, but had a different frequency to it, something that in a human might have been a suppressed and involuntary response to something genuinely unexpected. Scythe stopped screaming. She had not eaten anything, she had not been given anything, she had not been soothed or calibrated or offered a formulation. The bowl was sitting on the floor in front of her, and a human was sitting on the floor in front of her, and neither of those things was in any protocol she had yet encountered, and the part of her 14-month-old nervous system that had been locked for 6 hours in the feedback loop of distress and unmet need did something that distress and unmet need systems sometimes do when confronted with something genuinely novel. It paused. Not resolved, not satisfied, just paused, rerouted momentarily to the older and more fundamental process of figuring out what a new thing was. Her 4 eyes moved from Marcus's face to the bowl. They were still wet, still luminous with the residue of bioluminescent tears, still carrying in their depths the exhausted and embattled quality of someone who had been at this for 6 hours and had not yet received a satisfactory explanation for why. But they were looking at the bowl now with the pure, stripped-back attention of a small creature for whom the world had just introduced an unfamiliar variable. Her nostrils worked, short, quick, exploratory. The peanut butter was, Marcus knew, not a subtle smell. It was rich and heavy and specific in a way that cut through other odors with calm confidence. The dried mango added something lighter on top of it, something that whispered of sweetness without shouting. The cracker was mostly neutral, a vehicle, but even neutrality had a texture to it, a faint grain and salt note that was its own small announcement. Her wings, which had been fanning in rapid, agitated pulses for the better part of 6 hours, gave a single slow flutter, not the flutter of distress. Something more tentative than that. The flutter of a creature that is, against its better judgment, becoming interested. She looked at Marcus again. Four eyes, direct and assessing, slightly red-rimmed, carrying in them the residual heat of prolonged unhappiness, but also now underneath that something else. The calculating, careful look of a small person deciding whether to trust a new thing or not. Marcus did not move. He did not speak. He did not offer the bowl or draw attention to it. He simply sat and let the moment be what it was, and waited for Scythe to arrive at her own conclusions in her own time, which was, he had learned over years of working across species boundaries, the only way that any trust was ever actually built. She reached out. One small, clawed hand, 4 fingers, the claws currently rounded with the softness of immaturity, catching the creche light in the same liquid way as her scales, extended toward the bowl with a deliberateness that was in total contrast to the frantic, furious energy of the past 6 hours. She was not grabbing. She was not hurling. She was reaching with the focused, careful intentionality of someone who has decided to investigate something properly, and intends to do it properly, and is bringing to this task the full gravity it deserves. Her fingers closed around the cracker. She picked it up and looked at it, turned it slightly, looked at the smear of peanut butter on its surface with an expression of concentrated scientific inquiry. Her nostrils worked again, closer now, more specifically, parsing the information at short range with the seriousness of a researcher approaching a primary source. The creche was entirely silent. 17 specialists, 1 hatchling counselor, and 1 human diplomat held collectively the kind of breath that does not get let out until something is resolved, and watched Princess Scythe III bring the cracker toward her mouth, and waited to find out what the world was about to become. The left. She smelled it first. This was, Marcus would later reflect, entirely in character for a creature whose primary sense of the world was apparently olfactory before it was anything else. The Vorkith nose, small and neat and structurally unassuming, was, according to everything he had read in 12 minutes of frantic shipnet searching, roughly 4 times more sensitive than the human equivalent, capable of parsing chemical information at a level of granularity that human language had not historically needed words for. An adult Vorkith could identify another individual by scent at a distance of 10 meters. A Vorkith elder could reportedly assess the emotional state of a room before entering it. What a Vorkith hatchling could do with a cracker that had peanut butter on it, held at a distance of approximately 20 centimeters from her face, was something Marcus was about to find out. Her nostrils worked in short, rapid pulses, not the panicked flaring of distress, but something more structured than that, more deliberate. A technical investigation. The kind of focused, systematic attention that serious inquiry required. She was not smelling the cracker the way a hungry creature smelled food. She was smelling it the way a scientist smelled an unknown compound. Carefully, thoroughly, with the full understanding that information gathered now would determine every decision made afterward, and therefore deserved to be gathered correctly. Marcus did not move. He had learned in the last several minutes that stillness was the most useful thing he could offer. Not encouragement, not coaxing, not the kind of animated, exaggerated warmth that adults often performed for small children, and which small children of sufficient perceptiveness could detect as performance. Just stillness and proximity, and the bowl on the floor between them, and the quality of attention that said, "I am here, and I am not going anywhere, and whatever you decide is fine." Scythe's 4 eyes were fixed on the cracker with an intensity that was slightly vertiginous at close range. Each of her eyes operated with some degree of independence, a predator heritage trait his cultural briefing had mentioned, though the Vorkith had been civilized for longer than humans had been upright. And when all 4 converged on a single point of focus, it created an impression of being very thoroughly looked at that Marcus found he was still adjusting to. The cracker was receiving the full force of this attention. It was, as far as Marcus could tell, bearing up well under the scrutiny. She bit it. Not enthusiastically, not hungrily, with the measured, considered deliberateness of someone taking a first step onto uncertain ground, testing the weight of it, assessing the give, committing only as much as the information so far warranted. The corner of the cracker disappeared, her jaw moved, her eyes went very still. Marcus watched her face with the careful, sideways attention of someone who does not want to apply pressure by staring directly but also cannot, in good conscience, look away. He had seen that quality of stillness before, in negotiators processing a proposal that was better than they had expected, in colleagues confronting data that required the revision of a long-held assumption, in anyone of any species, encountering something that did not fit the existing categories and needed a new category built in real time. She was chewing through the cracker, plain, slightly saline, faintly grainy. He watched her process it, watched her reach a tentative preliminary conclusion, watched her decide that the preliminary conclusion was insufficient and that more data was required. Then she hit the peanut butter. He saw the exact moment it happened, Not because she made a sound she did not immediately, but because her face changed in a way that was so total and so sudden that it was less like watching an expression shift and more like watching one landscape replaced entirely by another. Every feature she had rearranged itself. Her jaw slowed. Her four eyes, which had been still with the focused immobility of processing, went wide in a way that was unmistakably the same across species. The same widening that happened to any face when the nervous system received information it had not allocated sufficient capacity to handle. Her scales, which had been silver since birth and which Marcus had, in the past several hours, come to think of as simply the color she was, flushed. It happened in a wave, starting at her face and moving outward across her neck and shoulders, a slow surge of gold rising through the silver the way sunrise moved across a landscape, unhurried and total. It was vivid and startled and so specifically, purely the color of something that had just been completely surprised that Marcus found himself starring in spite of himself. He had never seen anything quite like it. It was beautiful in the way that entirely involuntary things were sometimes beautiful, not constructed, not performed, just the body telling the absolute truth in the most visible language it had. Behind him he heard the 17 specialists respond, not loudly, not dramatically. It was a collective subtle forward movement, a leaning in, a redistribution of weight toward the front of the semicircle, and it was accompanied by a quality of silence that was very different from the silence of the past 6 hours. The earlier silence had been the silence of failure of a room full of competent people who had run out of tools. This silence was something else entirely. This was the silence of people watching something they had not anticipated and were not sure they had the framework to explain. Vrethna, standing to Marcus's left, made a sound that he could not immediately categorize. It was short and involuntary and seemed to surprise her as much as anything else. She pressed two of her hands over her mouth and said nothing. Siveth looked up at Marcus. Her face was gold, not entirely, the silver was still there underneath, giving the gold a depth and complexity that pure gold alone would not have had. And her four eyes were very wide and very bright and contained in them an expression that Marcus had absolutely no cultural reference for but which communicated itself to him with perfect clarity anyway, the way some things did across every boundary, because they were simply true enough to need no translation. It was the expression of someone who has just discovered that the world contains something they had no idea the world contained, and who is not yet sure whether to trust this discovery or whether it will turn out to be a trick, but who is leaning very strongly toward trust because the evidence is right there in their mouth and is quite difficult to argue with. She looked back down at the cracker. The remaining portion of it sat in her small hand, and the peanut butter gleamed on its surface with the rich, dense, entirely unapologetic quality that peanut butter had always possessed. And she looked at it with the expression of someone conducting a final verification before committing to a conclusion. She looked up at Marcus again. He met her eyes, all four of them, doing his best, and said nothing, and kept his face as calm and neutral and unthreatening as he could manage, which was slightly complicated by the fact that something in his chest had done a thing that it sometimes did in negotiations when they turned, when the long hard work of showing up and waiting and not pushing finally arrived at the moment it had been building toward. And then Siveth laughed. It came out of her like something that had not known it was in there until the exact moment it emerged, sudden and unguarded and completely without the control or self-consciousness that came later, that adults spent years learning to apply to their spontaneous responses to things. It was not the crystalline formal sound of Vorkath's ceremonial expression. It was not dignified. It was not appropriate. By any standard Marcus could imagine the imperial court applying to the first clutch of the Empress. It had the quality of something purely physical, the body's direct and unmediated response to an experience that had bypassed every learned filter and arrived straight at the part of a creature that existed before learning, before culture, before the long process of becoming a person rather than simply being one. It was a hiccuping sound, a small, surprised, slightly undignified sound. It went up and then came back down and then went up again as she hiccuped a second time, and her wings flapped once in what seemed like involuntary emphasis, and her gold-flushed scales caught the light and scattered it in all directions. And Marcus Webb, sitting cross-legged on the floor of the imperial creche of the Vorkath Empire with a bowl of unauthorized earth food in front of him, felt the thing in his chest complete its movement and settle. Behind him, the room was completely silent. Not the silence of failure, not the silence of alarm, the silence of people who have been holding a great deal of tension for a great deal of hours and who have had that tension interrupted without warning by something they could not have predicted and who are now in the process of deciding what to do with the space the tension has left behind. Marcus heard in that silence the small sounds of 17 specialists who were very carefully not looking at each other, because looking at each other would require them to respond to what they saw in each other's faces. And they were, by training and profession and the accumulated habit of working in an imperial court, not people who responded to things in their faces without due consideration. Vrethnaw was the first one to make a sound. It was quiet and brief, and it was Marcus was almost certain, though he did not turn to verify, the sound of someone whose professional composure had encountered something that professional composure was not quite large enough to fully contain. As Siveth, apparently satisfied with her assessment of the laugh as an appropriate response to the situation, applied herself to the remainder of the cracker with a focus and efficiency that was remarkable given that she had 4 minutes ago been the embodiment of inconsolable distress. She ate it in 3 bites. Large bites, purposeful bites, the bites of someone who has made a decision and intends to see it through to completion. The peanut butter disappeared. The cracker disappeared. She chewed with the wholehearted commitment of someone eating something that deserved to be eaten wholeheartedly, and her scales stayed gold, and her wings made small pleased adjustments, and she made a sound while chewing that was not language but was extremely communicative. Then she turned her attention to the mango. The mango was a different experience entirely. Where the cracker and peanut butter had produced surprise, the sharp, startled response of encountering something wholly unknown, the mango seemed to produce something more like recognition, as though some part of her had been waiting for sweetness without knowing it had been waiting, and was now greeting it with the warmth of something expected and finally, belatedly arrived. She ate the 3 pieces with slow deliberateness, one after another, with a reverence that would have been funny if it had not been so entirely sincere. She held the second piece for a moment before eating it, examining it, as though she wanted to be sure she had properly acknowledged it before it was gone. She ate the third one and sat for a moment in what Marcus could only describe as a contemplative silence. Then she picked up the bowl. She was not strong enough to pick it up easily. It was slightly too large and slightly too heavy for her 4 small hands to manage with confidence. But she managed it, with the determined, slightly effortful grip of a creature that has decided a thing is worth doing and is prepared to apply whatever physical resources are necessary to do it. She lifted it. She looked into it. She tipped it slightly to check the sides and the bottom, with the thoroughness of someone who has learned that things that look empty sometimes are not. It was empty. She looked at Marcus. He had spent a decade learning to read alien expressions, to parse the nonverbal communication of species whose bodies arranged meaning entirely differently from human bodies, to hold in his mind simultaneously the cultural context and the individual variation and the situational factors that shaped any given face's message at any given moment. He had gotten quite good at it. He was, by any professional assessment, among the more skilled practitioners of cross-species nonverbal interpretation in the diplomatic corps. He did not need any of those skills. "Yeah, okay," he said and reached for the bowl. He went back to the kitchen. He moved somewhat faster than the first trip because the stakes of the first trip had been unknown and the stakes of this one were clear, and clarity was a significant logistical advantage. He made 3 more crackers. He was slightly more generous with the peanut butter this time, not extravagant but present, properly present, because she had demonstrated a preference and preferences deserved to be taken seriously. He added more mango. He thought about the fruit cocktail and decided to open the tin, because the fruit in it was sweet and soft and varied in ways that might be interesting to a palate that had just discovered the concept of interesting. And because he had, over the past 15 minutes, developed a feeling about this particular small person's curiosity that made him want to offer it things worth being curious about. He brought the bowl back. She was waiting with a patience that was entirely at odds with the creature who had been hurling platinum rattles an hour ago. She watched him cross the room. She watched him sit down. She had apparently accepted the floor situation, had perhaps even decided she approved of it, because she shifted slightly to orient herself more directly toward him when he settled. She watched him place the bowl between them. She did not grab it. She reached for it carefully and took a cracker, and ate it with a measured appreciation that was entirely different from desperation and was, Marcus thought, watching her, something that looked a great deal like enjoyment. Real enjoyment. The specific, conscious pleasure of a creature that knows it is having a good experience and is choosing to pay attention to the fact of having it, rather than simply consuming it. She tried the fruit cocktail. The small pale pieces of peach and pear and grape and cherry produced a sequence of expressions that Marcus catalogued privately as initial uncertainty, tentative interest, considered approval, and then, on the cherry, specifically a return of the gold flush that was smaller this time but no less genuine, the flush of continued delight rather than first surprise. She looked at him after the cherry with an expression he was beginning to read as communication, as the early and effortful language of a creature who had not yet developed the words for what she wanted to say but was working with what she had. He thought it meant, roughly, "This is good and you should know that I know that, and I want you to know that I know." "I know," Marcus said quietly. "I think so too." She ate until she was finished, and then she sat for a while in the simple, heavy-limbed way of small creatures who have eaten and are warm and are in the process of losing the battle against sleep. Her scales had settled from gold back towards silver, but it was a different silver now, softer, warmer, the way a sky looked different after a storm had passed through it and left the air clean. Her wings had folded entirely, tucked against her back with a completeness that spoke of muscles finally releasing a tension that had been held for hours. Her four eyes were open but had acquired a quality of openness that was more like the absence of close than actual wakefulness. The slow, soft unfocus of someone deciding incrementally that the world was acceptable and there was no further need to monitor it so closely. Marcus, sitting cross-legged on the floor with his back beginning to register a polite but firm complaint about the situation, watched this process with the specific attention of someone who does not want to move and startle something back into distress. He was also, somewhere underneath his monitoring attention, very tired. He had been awake since the 4th hour local time, had eaten nothing since a brief and insufficient meal at midday, and had spent 6 of the intervening hours in the specific draining state of sustained composure in the face of a problem he couldn't solve. The creche was warm. The floor, for all its indignity, was covered in 3 inches of pressure-sensitive polymer gel. As Siveth, who had migrated incrementally closer over the course of the last half hour, was leaning against his knee with the unconscious, total trust of a creature that had decided, for reasons of its own, that this was a safe thing to do. He did not mean to fall asleep. He did not, for the record, make any active decision in that direction. What happened was simply that the thing his body had been waiting to do for several hours found, at last, that the conditions for doing it were met: warmth, stillness, the absence of screaming, the soft weight of a sleeping hatchling against his knee. And it did it without consulting him, the way bodies sometimes made practical decisions ahead of their owner's awareness. His head dropped forward, his hand, still loosely holding an empty cracker sleeve, relaxed. His breathing slowed. The 17 specialists stood in their semicircle and looked at each other with the expressions of people who have witnessed something they are going to be describing for years and are already working out how to do it justice. Vrethna stood very still, her comm held in 2 of her 6 hands. The report she had been composing paused at a sentence she was no longer sure was adequate. The creche was quiet in a way it had not been quiet all day. Not the tense, effortful quiet of a room braced for the next wave of sound, but the genuine quiet of a space that had arrived, through an improbable sequence of events, at the particular piece of things resolved. The door opened 20 minutes later. The Empress Velsova IV was not a small person. She was tall even by Vorkith standards, and she carried the specific gravity of someone who had been navigated around and deferred to for so long that it had become a physical quality of their presence. The way the air arranged itself differently around her, the way the room oriented toward her without anyone consciously deciding to orient. Her scales were the deep, complex silver blue of full maturity, shot through with the pale gold tracery that marked the imperial bloodline, and she wore the expression of a person who had been summoned from something important by a report she had not entirely been able to parse, and who was prepared to respond to whatever she found with the full resources of an imperial administration and the focused personal attention of a mother. She stopped in the doorway. She looked at her daughter asleep, scales soft and warm and settled against the knee of a human diplomat who was also asleep. His head tilted forward, one hand open on the floor beside the bowl, the empty cracker sleeve still caught loosely between 2 fingers. She stood very still for a long moment. The 17 specialists did not move. Vrethna did not move. The creche held its breath in the way that rooms held their breath when someone with sufficient authority was deciding something. "What," said the Empress in a voice that was very quiet and very precise, "is the brown paste?" "Peanut butter, Your Radiance," Vrethna said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "It is a food product from Earth, a preparation of ground legumes. The ambassador brought it in his personal provisions." She paused. He researched the metabolic compatibility before offering it. The chemistry is the overlap is significant, 73%, he found it in a footnote. Another silence, shorter than the first. The Empress looked at her daughter's face, soft and slack and entirely without the furious, exhausted misery of 6 hours ago, just the smooth, untroubled face of a small creature that had been fed and was warm and had decided that the world was, on balance, fine, and something in the Empress's expression shifted in a way that was very small and very private, and not intended for the 17 specialists or for Vrethna or for anyone else in the room. She looked at Marcus, she looked at the empty bowl, she looked at the cracker sleeve. "Add it to the trade agreement," she said. She looked at Siveth one more time, with an expression that required no translation in any language in any part of the known galaxy, and then she turned and walked back out the door, and it closed behind her with a soft and final sound. Vrethna let out a breath that she had apparently been holding for the better part of 3 minutes. The trade agreement, when the bureaucratic council resolved its ceremonial precedence dispute 4 days later, and the signatories assembled for the finalization session, contained in Annex 7, subsection 4, a clause regarding the import and distribution rights of a ground legume preparation produced in the southern agricultural regions of Earth's North American continent. The clause was written in the careful, measured language of interstellar trade law, with all appropriate provisions for quality assurance and volumetric delivery schedules and dispute resolution mechanisms. The corps d'attaché who reviewed the draft agreement before signing flagged the clause with a question mark and a note that read, "Context." Marcus wrote back a single line, "It went very well, I'll explain later." He did not for some time fully explain. When he did eventually over a meal with colleagues who had been asking for years, he told the story simply and without embellishment, the way the best stories were told. The hallway, the datapad, the proximity law, the 6 hours, the shipnet footnote, the bowl, the gold flush of Scytheth's scales when she hit the peanut butter, the laugh. He told it the way you told a true thing, that had also turned out to be the most useful thing you had done in a decade of careful, skilled, well-intentioned work. The part he told last and most carefully was the part that he thought about most. The moment of crouching down to her level and looking at her and seeing in her face, underneath all the alien architecture of it, underneath the scales and the 4 eyes and the bioluminescent tears, something so entirely familiar that it had moved through every professional layer of him and arrived without friction at something personal. A small creature done with being handled, needing not a solution but a person, not a protocol but the floor, not the 47th formulation but a cracker and a smear of something strange and the willingness to sit still and wait and see. The thing about diplomacy, Marcus said on those occasions, is that most of it is just that. Most of it is just figuring out what someone actually needs as opposed to what the protocol says they need and then sitting on the floor about it. He always paused there. The peanut butter helps, he added, but mostly it's the floor.